Boy paid $30 for a dead man's junk. Harlan Briggs said it loud enough for the whole floor of Alderton Auction House to hear, and the men around him obliged with the kind of laughter that fills a room fast and doesn't leave much air for anyone else. Somebody go check if he walked here or if somebody dropped him off, because he sure isn't driving home with that thing. The thing in question was a water-damaged steamer trunk, mid-century. Its leather corners peeled back like old skin, its brass latches corroded shut. It had come out of the estate of a man named Edmund Corley, who had died at 81 in a rented room above a closed hardware store on Fulton Street, leaving behind no family anyone could locate and no will anyone could find. Only a room full of objects that a county assessor had valued at next to nothing. The trunk was the last item in the lot. It had been sitting in county storage for 14 months before anyone thought it worth the trouble of hauling out to be sold. Contents unknown, the auctioneer had said, because the latches had rusted shut and no one had bothered to force them. 22-year-old Ezra Colton had been standing in the back of the room when the trunk came out on a rolling cart, and something in him had gone very quiet. He had seen a trunk like that before. Not the same one, but the same vintage, the same brasswork, the same maker's stamp pressed into the leather just above the left latch, a small oval mark that most people walked past without reading. Ezra had read it. He had been reading marks like that for 3 years, ever since he started working afternoons and weekends at Mercer Restoration, the only serious antique repair shop in Alderton, a city of 40,000 people in the middle of a state that had largely decided the past wasn't worth keeping. The shop belonged to a woman named June Mercer, who was 64 years old and had the hands of someone 20 years younger and the patience of someone 200 years older. She had taught Ezra how to read an object the way other people read a face. She said everything a craftsman had ever done to a piece left a mark, and if you learned to look, the marks told you the whole story: who made it, when, whether they had cared about the work or just wanted to be done with it, whether someone had tried to repair it badly after, whether the damage was honest age or something worse. June had never said out loud that Ezra was the best student she had ever taken on. She was not the kind of woman who said things like that, but she had given him a key to the shop, which she had never given to anyone else, and she paid him more than she needed to. And on the evenings, when she stayed late to work, she always made 2 cups of coffee. Ezra had not planned to bid on anything that Saturday. He had come to the Alderton Auction House, the way he sometimes did on his days off, to look, to learn what was moving and at what price, to keep his eye trained on the market June had spent 40 years understanding. He had $12 in his wallet and about $410 in the account he kept at the credit union on Maple Street. The account he had been building for 2 years toward the deposit on a small commercial space where he might someday open his own restoration shop. The trunk came out and Ezra went still. He was not impulsive. That was the thing people who knew him said most often about him, that he was careful, that he thought before he moved, that you could set him in front of a problem and come back an hour later and find him still looking at it from every angle before he laid a hand on it. June said it was the quality that separated a good restorer from a butcher. You had to be willing to sit with a thing before you tried to fix it, but there was something in the maker's mark on the trunk, and in the particular way the leather had aged around the latches, that bypassed careful. He knew what that mark meant before he had fully decided to know it. He raised his hand at $20. Harlan Briggs was a man who bought and sold at auction the way some men played cards, not always because he wanted the thing, but because he enjoyed the game of it. He owned a salvage yard on Route 9 and a storage facility on the edge of town, and he had a way of standing with his arms crossed and his chin forward that made the space around him feel like his already. He spotted Ezra's raised hand and something shifted in his face, not quite surprise and not quite cruelty, but the particular pleasure a man takes when the morning produces something unexpected to entertain him. 25, Briggs said, not because he wanted a ruined trunk, but because a young black man spending what looked like money he couldn't spare on a thing the whole room had already decided was garbage, was the kind of sport that didn't cost much to enter. Ezra's jaw tightened. He had come with $410 in his account, and he had meant to spend none of it. He looked at the trunk, and he looked at the maker's mark, and he said 30. Briggs laughed. The room laughed with him. "Keep it," Briggs said, spreading his hands in a way that was meant to look generous. "I'm not going to take candy from a baby over a box full of mold. Let the boy have his treasure." The auctioneer called it sold with an expression that suggested he found the whole thing mildly ridiculous. And Ezra walked to the front and paid his $30 and stood in front of the trunk and thought about how he was going to get it to his car. He had driven a 10-year-old Civic. The trunk, when he tried to lift one end of it, told him it weighed more than it looked, and it looked like it weighed a considerable amount. He got it to the door of the auction house on a borrowed hand truck, before the attendant asked for the hand truck back, and after that it was just Ezra and the trunk and the 40 feet of parking lot between them and his car. And nobody offered to close that distance with him. The men who had laughed watched him work it across the asphalt in sections, tilting and dragging and resting, and a few of them said things that were helpfully offered as advice, and were really just more of what they had started inside. Briggs stood in the doorway with a cup of coffee and watched the way a man watches something he has already decided the outcome of. Ezra did not look at them. He had learned, not recently but years ago, that looking at people who had decided you were the joke only gave them the satisfaction of knowing the joke had landed. He kept his eyes on the trunk and on the distance left to cover, and when he finally had it loaded and the hatchback closed and he was sitting in the front seat with his hands on the steering wheel, he let out one long breath and then he drove. June was not surprised to see him pull into the alley behind the shop. She came out when she heard the car and looked at the trunk in the back without speaking, and he could see her reading it the way she read everything, her eyes moving slowly and then stopping on the maker's mark, and then she looked at him. "Corley, estate," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "It was on the lot sheet. Edmund Corley. Died alone. No family." June looked at the trunk again, and her face did something he had seen it do only a few times, a kind of careful settling, like someone deciding how much weight to put on a floorboard they're not sure of. "Let's get it inside," she said. They brought it in through the back of the shop and set it on the big work table under the good lights, and June walked around it twice before she touched it, which was what she always did, and Ezra stood on the other side and did the same. The trunk was worse up close than it had been under the auction house lights. The water damage had gone deep into the leather on the lid, and something had sat on top of it for a long time and left a ring of compression in the hide. 2 of the 4 brass latches were fused solid. The other 2 moved, but barely, and only with the kind of pressure that risked cracking the dried leather around them. "You know what maker's mark that is," June said. It was not a question. "Harwick and Sons," Ezra said. "Chicago. They stopped making trunks in 1962. This one's mid-50s. The oval stamp is pre-58, before they changed the typeface." June nodded slowly. "Edmund Corley," she said again, and she said it like a person testing the weight of a word they haven't spoken in a long time. "He had a repair shop. Before this building was mine, before it was the last owner's. He was the first person in this city who called himself a restorer rather than a repairman." Ezra looked at her. "He taught your predecessor," June said. "A woman named Addie Clark, who taught me. He closed up when I was still an apprentice. I heard he'd gotten sick." She paused. "I didn't know he was still in Alderton." There was a weight to that silence. Ezra did not push on it. He had learned that June said things in her own time and not before, and that waiting was not the same as missing them. They worked the latches that evening with penetrating oil and the narrowest tools June kept in the drawer she called the impossible drawer, the one for problems that shouldn't be possible to solve without breaking something. And by the time the shop light had shifted from afternoon yellow to evening orange, they had all 4 latches moving, and Ezra's hands were stained dark, and his back ached from bending, and the trunk was still closed. "Tomorrow," June said, the way she said it when she meant that some things needed to sit overnight and be looked at fresh. Ezra drove home to his apartment, the 2nd floor of a house on Clement Street, where the landlord was a retired school teacher who left newspapers outside his door and never raised the rent. The apartment was small and orderly, the way the spaces of people who work with their hands tend to be, because a person who spends their days managing precision comes home needing things to be where they left them. He had a workbench along one wall where he kept his own tools and the pieces he was working on his own time. He had a shelf of reference books above it, the kind with photographs of maker's marks and construction techniques and the wood grain patterns that told you what region a piece had come from, if you knew how to read them. He did not sleep well. He lay in the dark and thought about Edmund Corley, a man he had never met, who had died alone above a closed hardware store, who had been the first person in this city to call himself what Ezra was trying to become. He thought about the trunk and what June's face had done when he said the name, that careful settling. He thought about Harlan Briggs and the coffee cup in the doorway and the way the room had laughed. He thought about the $30 rolled in the front pocket of the jeans he had hung over the chair, which was all the money he had spent, and about the $410 left in the account, which was less than it had been before today, but was not gone, and about the deposit he was saving toward, and about whether he had done something stupid. Then he thought about the maker's mark, and the particular way the leather had aged, and the fact that Edmund Corley had been the man who taught the woman who taught June, and he stopped thinking about whether he had done something stupid, because he had learned, if nothing else, to trust what his hands knew before his head caught up. He was back at the shop by 7 in the morning, earlier than June arrived, and he made coffee and waited. And when June came in at 8 and saw him there, she did not say anything about it, only poured herself a cup and joined him at the work table. It took another hour of careful work to open the trunk without splitting the leather at the hinges, which was the point of greatest risk, where the hide had dried unevenly and a degree too much pressure would crack it across the grain. Ezra worked the hinges with a soft brush and a conditioning oil he made himself from a formula June had given him, working it in by hand in small circles, and he could feel under his fingertips the slow return of something like flexibility to the dried leather, the way a stiff joint loosens when it's been worked gently over time. When the lid finally came up, it moved with a sound that was almost a sigh, as though the trunk were releasing a breath it had been holding. The smell was first. Old paper and cedar and something faintly metallic, the particular mixture of a sealed wooden space that has kept its contents for a long time. Then the contents themselves, and Ezra looked at them, and then he looked again because the first look had not made sense. It was not what the county assessor had decided was in there, which was nothing. It was not soot and disappointment, as the auctioneer had implied. On the top, folded in brown paper tied with cotton string, were 6 tools, a set of chisels of a kind Ezra recognized immediately. The handles turned from a dark fruitwood, the blades hand-forged, each one wrapped in oilcloth against the rust. Below the tools was a wooden tray that lifted out, and under the tray were papers. Ezra lifted the tray carefully and set it aside, and June came around the table to stand beside him, and they both looked down at what was underneath. There were drawings, dozens of them, some folded, some rolled tight and held with a rubber band that had gone brittle and snapped when he touched it. Technical drawings, the kind made by hand before the software that made them obsolete, rendered in pencil so precise and consistent, it looked mechanical but wasn't. Furniture drawings, plans and elevations and cross-sections with measurements noted in a small, extremely legible hand. Chairs, tables, a writing desk, a sideboard, a set of shelves with joinery details called out in careful sequence, each mortise and tenon drawn from 3 angles. The quality of them stopped Ezra's breath. He had seen professional drawings. He had seen drawings in the reference books on his shelf, illustrations from cabinetry manuals and craftsman's guides. These were not like those. These were the drawings of someone who had spent years thinking through a problem before they put pencil to paper, and the thinking showed in every line. The proportions were not standard. They were worked out, adjusted, refined. There were notes in the margins, small corrections, and in several places a line crossed out and redrawn slightly differently, the kind of revision that happens when you have stared at something long enough to know what it needs. Under the drawings was a ledger, the bookkeeping kind, its cover worn to the board. Ezra opened it and found it was not bookkeeping at all. It was a record of commissions, dates and client names, and what had been made and what had been paid, kept in the same small legible hand as the drawings, going back to 1948. The last entry was 1971, and on the inside front cover, in the same hand, a name: Edmund Corley, Furniture and Restoration, Alderton. June had gone very still beside him. "He made furniture," Ezra said. "He was designing and making furniture for 20 years, and nobody—" He stopped. "Is any of his work still around?" June was quiet for a moment. "I don't know," she said, and her voice was careful. "I knew he was a restorer. Addie never mentioned furniture. Or these." She reached out and laid 2 fingers on the edge of the nearest drawing, not touching the paper itself, just the border. The way you touch something you are not sure you have permission to touch. She never mentioned these. Ezra looked at the tools wrapped in oilcloth. He lifted one of the chisels out and held it under the light and looked at the blade. Hand-forged. The bevel was ground at an angle he had seen in one of his reference books. A technique from a tradition that had been largely lost by the time the books were written about it. Kept alive by the kind of craftsman who learned from older craftsmen and passed it forward. He turned the handle in his hand and felt the weight of it settle into his palm the way a well-made tool does, and something moved in him that was not quite grief and not quite pride and did not have an easy name. He set the chisel down gently and looked at the ledger again, at the list of names and commissions, a city's worth of furniture made over 20 years. And he thought about where that furniture might be now, in houses and offices and storage units, unrecognized, unattributed, bought and sold and refinished and not known for what it was. He thought about Edmund Corley dying alone above a closed hardware store while 30 years of his work sat in houses around the city under other people's names. The drawings were the thing. He understood that slowly, standing at the table in June's shop in the morning light. A craftsman's drawings were not just plans. They were argument. They were evidence. If you had the drawings, you could look at a piece and demonstrate that it matched, that the proportions were the same, that the joinery was identical, that the measurements in the margin of a 40-year-old sketch were exactly the measurements of the chair in a collector's showroom that was listed under maker unknown. Harlan Briggs had laughed at $30 for a box full of mold. Ezra thought about that for a moment. Then he went to the phone and called the County Historical Society. What happened next did not happen in a day or a week. It happened the way important things tend to happen, which is slowly and then all at once, with a long stretch of patient work in between that most people never see and therefore never account for. The County Historical Society sent a woman named Dr. Patricia Ashe, who arrived at June's shop 3 days later, and spent 4 hours with the drawings and the ledger and the tools, and at the end of 4 hours she sat back and removed her glasses and cleaned them slowly, which was something Ezra recognized as what people do when they need a moment before they speak. "This is significant," Dr. Ashe said, which was the careful way of saying something that she seemed to find difficult to say any other way. She explained it in pieces. Edmund Corley had been one of perhaps a dozen black master craftsmen working in furniture design and production in this region between 1945 and 1975, a period when that work was systematically underdocumented, not by accident, by the specific practice of crediting dealers and sellers rather than makers, of letting attribution go unmarked when the maker was black and the buyer was not, of letting the record say maker unknown rather than acknowledge the name. Corley's work had been sold through a dealer named Vance Whitfield, who had run a gallery on Alderton's east side for 20 years. Whitfield had kept the commissions and kept the clients and kept the credit, while Corley made the furniture in a workshop on the same block where June's shop now stood, and walked home at the end of the day past the gallery window where his chairs sat under other men's names. This was not a story anyone had told. It was a story that had been prevented from being told, the way such stories are, not by violence but by the quieter mechanism of leaving names off documents and letting time do the rest. The ledger changed that. The drawings changed it further. And the work itself, The furniture, spread across decades and estates, and the back rooms of antique dealers who had never known what they had, could now be identified. Ezra had found all of this for $30. When he carried the drawings and the ledger to the county courthouse 4 weeks later, it was not a dramatic morning. He had called ahead. Dr. Ash had made calls of her own. There were already people at the courthouse who were expecting to see him: a curator from the State Arts Commission, a woman from the university's American Studies Department who had driven 2 hours, and a reporter from the city paper who stood on the steps with a notebook and watched Ezra come up the walk with the trunk in the back of a borrowed pickup and wrote it down. Harlan Briggs was not at the courthouse. He was at his salvage yard on Route 9, which was where he was most mornings. Though people who knew him said he had been quieter than usual since the story started moving through town, since the paper ran the first piece under the headline, "Alderton Man's Discarded Trunk Held Lost Legacy of Black Craftsman." And people started recognizing the furniture in their own houses, the chair in the corner, the table in the hallway, and calling the Historical Society to ask if what they had was a Corley. It turned out a great deal of what the city had was a Corley, more than anyone had thought to ask about, which was the point. Briggs did not come to the courthouse, and he did not come to the exhibition the Historical Society put together 3 months later in the Civic Center, where Edmund Corley's drawings were mounted and framed, and his tools were displayed in a case, and 6 pieces of his furniture were gathered in one room for the first time, each one with his name on the label. He drove past the Civic Center on the way to the salvage yard and on the way home, and he did not stop. Ezra knew this because the salvage yard was on the same road, and he drove past it sometimes on his own way across town, and the white truck was always there. He did not feel the need to be in the same room as Harlan Briggs for the reckoning. He had not done what he did to have a reckoning. He had done it because a trunk had a maker's mark and a dead man's name in the ledger, and $30 seemed like a reasonable price to pay to find out what that meant. The morning the Civic Center opened the exhibition, June closed the shop and the two of them went together, and they stood in front of the framed drawings for a long time without saying much. The tools were in the case with a small card that described the forging technique and the tradition it came from. And beside them was a photograph, the only one the Historical Society had been able to locate, a black and white image of a man standing in a workshop, his hands at his sides, surrounded by the clean lines of half-finished furniture. He was looking at the camera with an expression that was not quite a smile and not quite serious, the expression of someone who is at home where they are standing and does not feel the need to perform it. Ezra looked at the photograph for a long time. He did not know Edmund Corley. He had no memory of him, no story passed down, no photograph soft at the corners, but standing in the workshop of his hands, surrounded by the drawings that had come out of the trunk, that the whole room had laughed at for $30. Ezra felt the particular steadiness of a person who has done the right thing, not because it was dramatic, but because it was the only thing that made sense. The State Arts Commission awarded a posthumous grant in Edmund Corley's name. The Historical Society established a fund for the documentation of undercredited craftsmen in the region. The university's American Studies Department added his work to the curriculum. None of this happened fast. None of it was one thing. It was 100 small decisions by 100 people, accumulated over months, and it started with a maker's mark on a leather trunk that the county assessor had written off as nothing, and a young man in the back of an auction room who knew how to read what he was looking at. Ezra did not take the money the commission offered for the donation of the trunk and its contents. He let it go to the fund. He kept 3 things. He kept the receipt, $30, handwritten on an Alderton auction house slip, folded small in the pocket of his work jacket, because a man should remember where a thing began and what it cost him to start. He kept one of the chisels, the one that had settled into his palm like it was made for it, which he cleaned and oiled and set on his own workbench beside his own tools, and used. And he kept the first drawing he had unrolled that morning in June's shop, the chair with the worked-out proportions, and the careful notes in the margin, which he had framed and hung on the wall above the bench, in the commercial space he had finally rented on Fulton Street, 2 blocks from where Edmund Corley had kept his own workshops out 60 years before. It was not the same room, but it was the same street, in the same city, doing the same work, with hands that had learned to read what a maker leaves behind in the marks of his tools and the grain of his choices. Ezra would not have said the chisel fit his hand because it had been made for him, but he might have said that some tools find their way to the hands that deserve them, and that the path is not always straight, and sometimes it runs through the middle of a room full of laughter, and out the other side, into something the people in that room could not have seen coming. Which is only to say, the price of a thing has never once been its measure, and the men who laugh loudest at a purchase are almost always the ones who did not know how to look. Think about that the next time you pass something by, because the room has already decided it isn't worth your time. Because somewhere in this city, right now, there is a trunk in a lot that someone dismissed before they read the mark on the side of it. And the only question is whether the person who finds it will know what they're looking at. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who works with their hands, who builds things, who has ever been told that what they love isn't worth the floor space. They'll know what it means. And if you want to hear more stories like this one, stay close. There's always another room. There's always another mark that somebody missed.